Good evening to all viewers. You're welcome to yet another webinar in the series of International Decade for the People of African Descent Emancipation Celebrations. This evening, we're going to be celebrating Buxton, 180 years of Buxton, and looking at the question of sustaining historical villages. To engage you in this exercise, we have in the first instance, Brother Ikeana, who will be interviewed by Brother David Hines. And they will focus on the village movement and the celebration of the 180th anniversary of Buxton. When that interview would have been completed, we'll then have a panel comprising Mr. Rexford Jackson, an attorney at law, David Hines, and myself, yours truly, Vincent Alexander. We will then make presentations, which will be followed by interactive session, including questions and answers from those of you who are viewing. Once again, I therefore welcome you to this continuing series of activities to mark emancipation. We are into the 182nd year of emancipation, the 180th year of the anniversary of Buxton. So I'd like to welcome now Venerable Sage Ikeana, who's joining us from the United States, and Dr. David Hines, who will be interviewing him, takes us through the first segment of this activity.
Thank you, Vincent. And I would like to thank Ikeana G for doing this series on emancipation. And thank you for highlighting Buxton. As a Buxtonian, I will take the privilege on behalf of all Buxtonians at home and abroad for thanking you for highlighting our village, which marks its 180th anniversary of the founding of the village. Of course, our village needs no introduction, so I will go into the interview with Brother Yusi. Brother Yusi, welcome to Ikeana G's discussion.
Thank you, brother. I thank Vincent Alexander also for his welcome to this forum. Thank you.
And thanks, Brother Yusi. We've been colleagues for well over 40 years, and we have had discussions on a range of topics, political, economic, cultural, village. But I find that perhaps the topic that you get most excited about is this topic of the post-emancipation villages and the village movement. In fact, I had the privilege of doing an interview with you for publication in the book, The Legend, Post-Emancipation Villages in Guyana, The Making of World History. And I was interested then in the topic of the book, and I'm still interested now, especially the part that says the making of world history. And so I want to start with that first question to you. Why do you describe the post-emancipation villages and the village movement as world history, the making of world history?
Thank you, brother. The episode of the making And constructing of these villages was quite astonishing. It took place 2 centuries after the first enslaved foreparents of ours from the continent of Africa had been landed on these plantations in the Caribbean and Guyana. And everyone thought the light was out. Everyone thought they had finished with these Africans and turned them into talking tools. Something a little above the level of the lower animals. But before the 1st of August, 1838, as we know, there were rumblings in the Caribbean, rumblings on the sugar plantation, stretching along the coasts of South America and the islands of the Atlantic. There were escapes, there were uprisings, some of them very important. And there was a whole atmosphere of instability. It could not hold. Our historians have told us that if the Act of Emancipation had not passed the House in 1833, the slaves would have taken the plantations over themselves. It might not have been the same kind of taking over as happened later. So it was world history. And as we get into it, we shall see that many historical things that were unique in the history of the human race took place within the ambit and bosom of the village movement.
Well, thank you, Brother Yusuf, for that introduction and that explanation. Of course, historians have cited the fact that the village movement, in many regards, has been unique to Guyana. Why do you think that it was unique to this particular space?
I think the form the villages took was unique. And I don't know everything about the whole hemisphere, but in Jamaica, there was a counterpart of the village movement arising in similar circumstances, but still, the villages of Guyana are unique in origin and in the way they conduct themselves for the next half century or so, and for the contribution they made to what we now call democracy. The word is very loosely used, and we sometimes do not reflect where it came from, because the coast of Guyana, we know that the hinterland had been occupied by indigenous people of several language groups, some 13 or 14. We know that they had been also enslaved previously, but their command of the terrain did not allow that enslavement to endure as long as it did among the captives from Africa who were in a new place. They were in a new place in Suriname too, but they escaped into the forests and became maroons and are there to this day. In Guyana, the exceptional thing is that, and no one can deny it, this was not a movement sponsored by any external force. This was a self-emancipation movement, a movement of complete self-emancipation. Let us try to shorten it as much as possible. In 1834, the British government made a compromise with the plantation owners after negotiation. In the atmosphere of that instability that reigned, I mean, when I say instability, everyone knows things were falling apart. The British government moved very quickly to negotiate with the slave owners, the plantation owners, not with their talking tools, the so-called slaves, the enslaved. They had to be spectators at this great drama taking place between the very elevated class above them and their rulers in England. Queen Victoria has got a lot of credit for signing the papers, but Queen Victoria was not even on the scene in 1833 when the act was passed. And the fact is that people were ready. In 1834, the deal included a period of forced labor. You are free as human beings. You can no longer be bought and sold. You are free on paper, but you are bound to work. In Lusignan, they had a very well-known character called Born for Work. These were born for work. They had to work on the very plantations where they had been enslaved until some unknown date in the future. It was not a fixed date. The date depended on what was taking place. And what was taking place was continuing instability. We remember Damon, who personifies and dramatizes the doubt in the consciousness of the enslaved. Damon wanted to know in Essequibo, in the act of passive resistance, which they staged on the night of July 31st in the churchyard, well known there. A drama that is well described in Tommy Paine's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, that Changed the World. And they held the first act of passive resistance, perhaps in the hemisphere, to protest against this duplicity of the rulers, freeing them and enslaving them at the same time. As we know, Damon was hanged as a traitor, as a rebel. In great perplexity, others were banished. Now, in Victoria, and although we are celebrating Buxton, and we shall, Buxton friendship, I must stress that these were all spiritual children of Victoria, the Victoria movement. Victoria was the center of this self-emancipation. The 1834 compromise paid the slaves, the enslaved, still enslaved, overtime wages in each day that they worked more than 7.5 hours. Those were the sources of money that the slaves accumulated and saved in various ways until glorious morning come on the 1st of August, 1838. The interesting thing is that those who took over Northbrook and named it Victoria, you see, they had no ambassadors then, but they had diplomats, and they thought it would be a good thing to name this after the girl queen in England. They named it Victoria. They must have been networking for some time. They came from 4 plantations. They were not free to move, to travel. In fact, the only little freedom they enjoyed existed only from 1825. After the 1823 uprising on the east coast of Demerara, in which so much blood was shed, 800 being shot down at Bachelor's Adventure in one day, and in which every corner of the East Coast had been organized in cells for a peaceful takeover. After that uprising that brought to light the attitude of Reverend John Smith, a Christian minister, who encouraged slaves to work cheerfully, but hated slavery, and was seen as a mutineer in conspiracy with the enslaved, a false accusation. These people at Victoria had negotiated with plantation owners. Northbrook, this is represented and portrayed in some drama that exists here and there. The significant thing about Victoria is that we don't know when, but in 1839, and I am speaking on the authority of handwritten notes by Hugh Payne, known as Tommy Payne, for many years the archivist in Georgetown. He has made popular a letter of the governor of that time to the colonial office, testifying that the rules made by the Victoria pioneers and emancipators were self-made. When his principals began telling him, these people are setting up villages, you know, what are you going to do? They have to be controlled. He wrote back saying, we could not make better rules than they had made for themselves. And we don't know how many people are going to join those villages under those rules. But it's important. This is one of the very, very significant things. They made their own constitution. They were lawgivers. They made their own laws for their self-governance. And among those laws were advanced enactments. I call them enactments because that was their method of lawmaking. They didn't have to have a parliament. They were sitting as a lawmaking body. And anyone fond of history will understand the significance of that. The women did not have to hold a special campaign to fight for the vote. There were women enslaved. There were women apprentices in those 4 years between 1834 and 1838. And they had savings like the men. And they put shares into this package that was being used to buy a cooperative, to buy an old plantation cooperatively and rename it. And they had the vote from the word go. Many women in the enslaving countries did not have any vote at that time. They had the vote, and the lawmakers enacted that twice a year, at least, I mean, every 6 months, there would be a general assembly. These people were thinking on a grand scale. They were legislating. There would be a general assembly, and the elected officers, according to the rules made, the president, the secretary, committee members, they would have to give an account to the entire village of their stewardship in the 6 months gone. No country in the hemisphere has that rule now. None. None. And that is advanced legislation of self-empowerment and accountability. And officers who were in contempt of the laws could be brought to book. The interesting thing is that although they named the village Victoria, they dedicated buildings to the praise of God, not of Victoria, to the praise of God, who they said had delivered them from, very interesting word, degradation. That word made a great impression on me when I read it first. These enslaved people who had been dumbed down for centuries knew that they had been degraded. And they said, God has rescued us from our denigration, and we must have a building dedicated to that great act of salvation. So they were not confused about philosophy and all of that. The rules they made also had a little judiciary in it to settle disputes. And the judiciary, the judicial committee, as I call it, because I'm naming these things according to their function. The officers elected were an executive. The people who made the laws were legislators. And those who came together every 6 months to review the work of managing the village were auditors. They were self-empowered auditors. And that was the accountability machinery. Now, the British had nothing to add to that, nothing. And these laws became very popular. And Alan Young, one of my sources, the first of my sources, Alan Young was a land surveyor, and so very much acquainted with every square inch and square foot of the territory. And he said that these rules were generally applied in the cooperative villages. They were generally applied. They copied the spirit of these rules and applied them, perhaps with some changes here and there. Now, the time came when they had to find resources. They had used up all their savings for capital expenditure in acquiring land. And this was unique about the Africans. The Africans in Guyana were the only people of all the imported labor forces that were brought in that were bound to use their own savings for their own rehabilitation. It did not happen like that in the other cases. And if we have time, we should get into that. But their savings from their labor is what they used to acquire their homes, their new homes, their land, first of all, their land, the territory on which they built their homes. And they had to lay them out. They had to lot out, they had to pay land surveyors. They had to do everything. They had to find money to build the houses. And they had no source of credit. And the empire did not come to their aid. The governor did not come to their aid in those material matters that had to do with their survival. In fact, on the 1st of August, 1838, or was it 1834? I think 1838. In St. George's Cathedral, there was a grand service. And the text used by the bishop was very telling. said from the Bible, the powers that be are ordained of God. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers. The powers that be are ordained of God. Who therefore resisteth the power, resisteth God. That was a kind of encouragement. These freedom seekers and freedom fighters got. Cool it, lay down your arms. Don't be too uppish. It is God who put these powers over you. And if you resist, you're resisting God. Perhaps the slaves or the enslaved believed some of that, but in practice, they ignored it totally. They went to work. One dramatic, something I forgot to mention, which is very inspiring in the year of the decade set by the United Nations for peoples of African descent. What does that African descent mean? The person who came out as the moving spirit in Victoria was a man called William Baptist. He, his wife was a proprietor. There were only 3 women proprietors. But we know what goes on in these cases. The woman's money is in there, although her name is not there. She's the one who tied up the money in the knots, in the belly band at these places, and was able to collect it and bring it forward when time came to pay up. And a matter of great pride is that these people bought the villages with a down payment, and in every case known, the installments were paid on time. There was no delinquency. There was no delinquency in payment. And when it came to the time of building houses, I was saying, William Baptist, at that dramatic moment, called himself William Africa. William Africa. Now, who told them about Africa? That's the point. Who told them about Africa? So the United Nations is very perceptive. These Africans had not been lost. They had not become countryless people, homeless people. They were very conscious of their origins. And this man gave a gift to all of us and has given us something to be very proud of. And the continent of Africa something to be very proud of by naming himself William Africa. I think there was a great inspiration. There was no parson at the time encouraging Africa. Africa was supposed to be the dark continent, the land of savages and darkness and so on. But the people had a different idea, a different sense. I've told the story quite often of my childhood in Lusignan, where I was born, sugar plantation. You had bongyard, nigger yard, and white quarters. I used to play near to an old Congolese woman living in her range. And I would go there in the afternoon, running on the grass. And she would always turn to me, if you have heard this before, please forgive me. It is my creed. She turned to me and said, Pitney, Congo a high nation. Congo a high nation. I never forgot those words. At the time, I didn't understand them. I know a high nation is not a low nation. I know these people I was living among were supposed to be Congo. But why tell me, a 4-year-old child, Congo a high nation? Well, I'm glad it stuck in my memory. And I began to make sense of it afterwards. She was answering all this mythology about Africa being a land of savages. And she knew what we did not know. She knew that she had come from a civilized society where human beings lived and where work and life and thought and culture and everything were active. So in 1856, another governor arrived from England, apart from the one who said every soul was subject to the higher powers, and if you resist, you're resisting God. This one had other ideas. This one must have read the dispatches of his predecessors, who were very afraid of African women. Very afraid of African women. A.R.F. Weber records this in his book, his chronicle, The Centenary History of British Guyana. There were governors who testified that they would rather have anything to do with anybody except African women. They did not want to see them around. They were too troublesome. And if you ever read or saw the unstooling of a chief in Ghana and in African society, you would know why. Because if a chief misbehaved, he could be unstooled. And he would be sitting there in a kind of people's court, and the accusations are coming fast and furious from all around. So this governor wanted to have nothing to do with African women. His name was Woodhouse. The first gift he gave to the village movement was to deny women the right to vote. That is when he took away the vote from women, 1856. About 1962, 1862, or there about 1892, another governor came named Gormanston. He was a viscount. That is a lesser noble, one of the lesser nobility. And he went further. He denied women the right to be elected. As I said, when I launched the book, The Legend, here in Atlanta, where I am now, in February at a Radical Book Fair, I regretted that the men did not stand up. They knew originally that women were as entitled as they were to the vote because the vote had been bought by labor. But when the governor took away the vote and took away the right of the women to be elected, there was not the usual uprising or signing of petitions. At least we have not heard of these petitions protesting, because the men then, I guess, were like men now. They had their, their male stuff, male domination, authority, which some women allow, and they took it in their stride. So the governor got away with it, or life might have been different. I don't know if I've exhausted that question.
Well, yes, and you've gone beyond, and that leads me to the next question. You touched on it, on the question of the economy, because you talked a lot about the governance system, and it's important, I think, as we in Guyana today are debating the question of democracy and governance. And I find it instructive that the formerly enslaved very quickly after emancipation were able to settle down into a democratic system that they brought into being by themselves. And, we often talked about the lessons of history. And I think that that's a very important lesson of history, not just for the villages, but for the country and the region. Let's talk a little bit about the economy, because the question of survival was important, and the question of denial, which you spent a lot of time on by the British, the colonialists, was very striking. Talk a little bit about how the villagers went about constructing their economy and their economic system.
Thank you. The building of the economy goes back to these 4 years, between 1834 and 1838, the so-called apprenticeship. And it goes back, in fact, to 1823, the East Coast uprising, because that uprising, as I said, caused certain liberties. For the first time in 1825, slaves could marry. Any other body they brought to Guyana for labor came with a special advantage of family. They could have families, lawful families. The Portuguese were the first. The Portuguese arrived here even before emancipation. They came in 1835. They arrived before 1838 when bond labor ended. Now, they could all marry and have families. Africans alone, black-skinned Africans alone, had been singled out as people not worthy of marriage. And yet, if you see what they write about our family life and our heritage and children and all of that, you would think, and Africa was a country of very strong family systems, different from those of the West, as most things in the East are, but they did not have the right to marry and have families. That only came after 1825. And with that, the right to have gardens, to have pigs, to have, some petty economy, which of course helped to ease the burden on the slave owners, but also became a source of trade. Africans are traders. I mean, if you read African history, you see that trade is in the lifeblood of Africans. From one country to another, long caravan of camels and all of that, going along, trudging from one country to the other. But they want us to believe that the people they brought here were savages. Now, you are going to bring savages to run plantation that you invested, people with no skills, forget it. They brought people from agricultural countries who had a sense of agriculture and other skills as well to further their investment. White man does not play with money like that. He's not going to do that. They brought people with skills to the West. So after they became free, the first thing was agriculture. They had lands and they worked those farms cooperatively. There's record in Buxton, in Buxton and Victoria that the cooperatives paid dividends for several years. Big crop was plantains. And what are they going to do with all this plantain? Who will eat this plantain? They had begun to import labor. And the only historian that has given credit where it belongs to the Africans for feeding Guyana in those dreadful years was A.R.F. Weber. A.R.F. Weber was a West Indian. He was a Caribbean man, a mulatto from Trinidad. And he played a part in the political life of this country in the 1920s. So what did they do apart from agriculture? Out of the farms, they went in, they had some food processing. That is the name they give to the activity of turning agricultural products into something that will last. You had things like cassava, you had cassava bread, you had casserie, you had coconut oil, chanchi, and the various byproducts. Coconut oil is now known to be a healthy oil, superior to the one that succeeded it in Guyana called Friol. We went to exhibitions. My mother took me to an exhibition in 1931 when I was 6. And they had these big advertisement of the new companies like Wheating and Richter, you know, and they're going to be coming in making a kind of oil with big tanks and so, spoiling the oil and making it very dangerous for people who take it, resulting in a lot of cardiac, heart trouble and that kind of thing. And they've gone right back now to the simple coconut oil. And there are books written about it as a healthy food. But apart from that, they did things with their hands. The tinsmiths were very active, and they were making a lot of domestic articles for the kitchen, for the drawing room, for various usages out of tin. Ladles to dip soup from the pot, saucepans, and you can imagine what gutters for the houses, gutters and pipes and everything, zinc sheets. But they did not make zinc sheets, they were imported, but they made the gutters. And Buxton alone had about several tinsmiths. I remember Mr. Butts and his brother, they were tinsmiths, and Mr. Gordon, Zoom Gordon, that had a gambling saloon up line opposite the Caleb's. Zoom Gordon was a great tinsmith, and there were others like that. So you think of a number of commodities that are being made and sold. People are going from village to village selling. Are these savages? Are these people who were uneconomic and didn't know what to do, didn't understand money, didn't understand business, didn't understand anything? The thing is, they had no help. There was no bank to back them up. You go to the bank looking like you and me to do what? Borrow? You have no credit worthiness. You have no credit worthiness, but if you look at the history of the purchases of the banks, of the villages, they were very credit worthy. Every historian has recorded that the installments were paid up to date. Let us say there was one failing. I can't remember where it was, if it was, but let us allow for that. But the general opinion and finding was the installments were paid up to date. In fact, in one case, which I have recorded in some of my writings, that the villagers, after they found the estate was in trouble, went and lent money to the estate manager. The villagers, they still worked on the estate, they lent him money. And they say if he wanted another loan any other time, he should apply. Yes, they were able to go back to their own plantation and lend money. So this talk is a lot of it is due to ignorance.
But you see, we're looking at the time, and I wanted to, yes, we're looking at the time, and I wanted to get in a very important aspect of the village movement, and probably will give you a chance to talk a little bit about Buxton. And that is, although the villages were bought, the lands were bought by Africans and turned into villages, and they were the original inhabitants, the villages became very ethnically diverse, which is something I think that we are not normally au fait with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yes, thank you very much. The dedication in this book, The Legend, that Brother David Hines and I are talking about is to the Victoria pioneers, to those who joined them throughout the coastline and follow that example. And also, very, very deliberately, I might not have done this 20 years before, but you think as you grow older and you see other dimensions of life and truth. And I said it is also dedicated to those of other races who joined them for various human reasons. At first, it was my impression that villages became a kind of rescue for Indians, indentured Indians, when they wanted to escape the plantation and had nowhere to go. They would come and get land in the village, buy it up, and But that's not the whole of it. And it is better and safer to say for various human reasons, because there was one case in which Krainoff was a village overseer in Buxton, and we were talking of economic development. I left this out, but Mr. Krainoff bought a sugar mill. Mr. Krainoff was not satisfied with being a village overseer in a free village. He had his own sugar mill in the back dam. And he brought a number of Indians from Nonprel, where he used to be, to work his sugar lands in Buxton. And that is how some of the Indians came to reside in Buxton. And that happened about 1890, in the 1890s. They came over from Rossignol and settled there. Now, the first Portuguese property I could find when I was writing Buxton Friendship in Print and Memory is registered in the village book, 1925. There were the Veras, the Corayas, and all of there were Chinese, the Choys, the Fungs. So, and yet Buxton remains solidly African. And the population was mainly African, about perhaps 4/5 African. But it was multi-ethnic. It had various religions. It was home to Hindus. It was home to Muslims. It was home to several Christian denominations. We don't hear anything about this at all. This is swept under the carpet as if it's like, jumpy umbrellas just springing up overnight. But we should think of this in relation to the nation, the sense of nationality that we so lack in Guyana. All of these groups, they went to the same schools. You sit down in the same benches with them day after day. You play games together and everything. Some of them became Christians and went to the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, not so much the Methodist and Congregational Church. And more than that, Buxton had a unique institution called the Buxton Scholarship, because E.F. Fredericks, the founder of the Negro Progress Convention, founded the Buxton Scholarship. He got together the men of, the schoolmasters and technical workers and people like that in the village. A significant one of them was S.J. Holder, a butcher, who became one of the outstanding businessmen on the east coast of Demerara. He had the best dry goods store in Buxton up to 1939 when he passed away. When he left Georgetown, there was not a store like Holder's store along the coast until later, until he died. Just when he was dying, Jules Pereira came in with time store from Maikoni. Now, Buxton Scholarship. What you hear about Buxton today is, you would think perhaps we are talking about apartheid South Africa, the way people wash their mouth on Buxton. One man who belonged to the legal profession, I'll spare him by not calling his name, he wrote a letter to the newspapers saying that the racial disturbances of the 60s began in Buxton. Total tomfoolery, total tomfoolery. You only have to go to the archives and look at the newspapers to see where they began. Because of the way Buxton has suffered, I refuse to put labels on other villages because we have been labeled badly and unjustly. I was telling about the Buxton Scholarship. One of the members of the board was Dr. Ramdi Hall, was not even a Buxtonian. The first Buxton Scholarship was given in 1924. 1924. And the first winners were one African and one Indian. In fact, the Indian came first. Not surprisingly, better family conditions, you know, that kind of thing, and perhaps with some individual qualities that others did not have. His name was Ball Green Nihal. Dr. Nihal became ultimately the first Guyanese bacteriologist and pathologist of the Georgetown Hospital, a top medical post. He was a product of the Buxton Scholarship. And boys and girls of any race were free to enter for that scholarship, to win it, and to go to Queen's College and Bishop's High School. Every year they sent somebody to Queen's College and Bishop's High School, the best schools in the country. And then Lawrence Clark was doing a history of Queen's College. He was astonished every time he opened the records, Buxton Scholarship, Buxton Scholarship, people coming from there to attend Queen's College. They could play a part in the village council. Not only that, but culturally, they did not feel oppressed. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, or I would quote a favorite passage of someone who said something about Indians and their feeling of national oppression. But in Buxton, they had a branch of the British Guyana East Indian Association. In Buxton, they had a branch of the Negro Progress Convention. They had the Buxton Scholarship. They had the Indian National Congress. In the 1940s, this was a group of Indians. If you look at me, you can see I'm no Indian, but I was an associate member of that organization. What was it doing? It was campaigning for Indian independence, because we who had developed any kind of political consciousness knew that India would open the door to the colonial world, the anti-colonial emancipation of the colonial world. So people like Sher Khan, people like Sipaltan, these people lived lives of dignity in Buxton. They had dispensers. They had African dispensers, Indian dispensers. There was one Indian dispenser named Mr. Singh, who had been a compounder on a ship taking Indian immigrants back to India. You had Mr. Francis, you had Mr. Abrams, you had Mr. Ogle. Mr. Cromwell later on, all these were dispensers. So all of these are economic activities apart from professions. And that is the way the villages work. But one thing I want to branch off very quickly on, Brother Hines, with your permission, and go to the Essequibo. Because how much more time have we got on this century?
We have about 5 minutes, Brother UC.
Oh, there you are. I'm not going to make it. I wanted to say that Africans, by their activity after 1838, civilized the coastlands of Guyana. They turned a part of the country that knew nothing but except plantation barbarism. What do I mean by plantation barbarism? One example, Mrs. Richards, who was said to be a shell-shocked World War I nurse, lived in her mansion, and if she heard a dog bark anywhere in the estate and it disturbed her, they say she was shell-shocked, she would send a gunman to shoot it. And that's that. And she once told, what's his name? She once promised to kick an Indian man. That's right, I think. He said, "We'll kick you." And he looked at her and he said, "Which foot you go kick me with, Missy?" And she understood she didn't bother to kick. That's right. He used to drive the car. So what I wanted to say was that there was not one pattern of villages. Apart from the 35 cooperative or communal villages, as Alan Young called them, there were proprietary villages, villages in which people bought their piece of land on their own from the same source of money, the gardening, the pig rearing, and the overtime pay. And an outstanding example of this is Queenstown on the Berbice coast. Queenstown was a proprietary village made up of several estates, front lands. Mr. Carberry had an eye to business, and his eye to business allowed him to see that he had to keep laborers, potential laborers, close to his plantation. So he laid out these beautiful plots of land and sold them to plantation workers. And of course, they remained there, and when he wanted labor, there was labor. So that.
You're talking about Queenstown on the Essequibo coast?
Yes.
Yes.
I didn't hear you.
Queenstown on the Essequibo coast?
Yes. Queenstown on the Essequibo coast.
Yes.
That is where Mr. Carberry laid out the front lands of 4 estates in house lots and created the village of Queenstown. Yes. So what I mean is that we are pluralist people. We don't have to all swear by the same book. And this is a mark of civilization. When you have everybody having to swear on one book, you know, it ends bad. It ends badly. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brother UC. I am sure I'm not getting to see the comments, but I'm sure that you would have provided us with a lot of information, a lot of context, a lot of analysis. And in this time when we are seeing a resurgence of the discourse on the usefulness of the villages and on the question of the village economy, I am sure this discussion goes a far way towards inspiring, especially the younger people in the audience. History is, of course, extremely important in understanding the contemporary, and I think you gave us quite a bit there. Please stick around while we continue the discussion.
May I make one other point, please?
Sure, Brother UC.
May I?
Yes. Yes.
Today we are talking a lot about governance and how contending groups in this society can arrange a form of government that, you know, satisfies everybody, not perfectly, everybody is not going to be satisfied. When we come to a point of everybody being satisfied, we stop growing. We can learn from the village Bedford acting and triumph. Bedford acting is mainly African, triumph mainly Indian. I happen to attend school there and I happen to teach there for part of my time. Now, we had village council elections and the conflict grew up. Who would be chairman? How do you choose this chairman? Bedford acting wanted one of their councillors would be an African. Triumph wanted one of their councillors would be an Indian chairman. Complexity. Those men got around the table and decided that they would rotate the chairmanship. 1 year, Levy, next year, Triumph. Matter finished. I think that's a standing example. It's a small thing, but it's a big thing. Because what is important is the principle. If one side had stuck out and said, no, we ought to be there all the time, and the other side said, no, we got to get in, nothing would happen. It would be a stalemate. So they amicably agree. 1 year, BV, next year, Triumph. And it went on like that for a series of years until I think national politics may have disrupted it. Thank you.
And of course, when
I apologize for being long-winded. Yes. I haven't said half of what I ought to have said, and I beg your forgiveness.
Thank you. And of course, when you brought that to my attention, I mentioned that you were therefore not the pioneer of power sharing in 1961, that they were doing it in BV Triumph long before.
That's right.
Yes, and a lot of people are asking about the book that you're referencing. Is the book, it's called The Legend, Post-Emancipation Villages in Guyana, Making of World History. And it's based on an interview that I did with Brother UC a few years ago. I think the book is on Amazon, I'm not sure. But
it's
I think
it is in
Austin's.
Franklin's. It's on sale in the bookstore in Georgetown.
It is on sale in Austin's in Georgetown if you're in Guyana. All right, Vincent, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Buddy UC, for taking us through that understanding of the birthing and development of our village system. I'm quite sure there are many, many questions that will arise from that, but it's been a rich experience to have heard all about the village and the way in which the village, in fact, represented plurality, although it has African beginnings. We're moving on, and I'm going to ask Brother Hines now to bring us into contemporary times in terms of the village movement and the present status of villages, and some more mention of the village that we are acknowledging, Buxton, the 180th.
Yes, thanks, Vincent. I have been over the last year trying to visit as many villages as I can, and the reason for that is because I felt that there were myths about the contemporary condition of the villages, and I wanted to prove that for myself. So one of the things you hear all the time is that the villages have moved away from agriculture. People don't plant anymore in the villages and so forth. And I was amazed when I went through the villages on the East Coast and on the West Coast of Demerara. I didn't get to touch the other villages. I was amazed at the level of economic activity in those villages, that people were still engaged in agriculture. Victoria, for example, when I went there, I was amazed that farmers came to the meeting that I was speaking at, and they came straight from the farm. And they were telling us that they had to get rid of food, because after they reap, they have market for one day or two, and then the rest of the food they have to get away with because there's no market for it. And it occurred to me, therefore, and Brother UC talked about this in the early villages, that there is economic activity in the villages, but they don't have any help. And people began to talk about difficulty in getting loans from the bank and so forth. For those of us who visit villages, the economic activity, small business, but you know, they don't have opportunity to rise and to expand. And so I think as we speak about moving the present situation of the villages, one has to begin with what is there. And I want to throw out here this evening that what is there is still the spirit of economic enterprise, but there is no help to expand these businesses. And therefore the myth that African people cannot do business, I think is what it is. It is a myth, and it's a question of resources to expand. And I think the source of this goes back to what Brother UC mentioned, and that is over time, the institutional inequities that develop in the Guyanese society. Some of us have been accused of importing the American model into Guyana. And they say that, look, in America, you have white people and black people, and white people keep black people out and so on and so forth, but that's not the case in Guyana. The point here that racism and racial inequities are based in the institutional arrangements in the society. And so therefore, in Guyana, it's not a case about whether Indians are oppressing blacks. That is not the case. And I've heard no African theorists who have said that. The point is that over a century and more, 180 years, 82 years, the institutions in the society, the institutionalized arrangements perpetuate inequity. And African Guyanese, given the fact that they came out of institutional slavery, as those inequities reproduce themselves, they reproduce the underdevelopment of African in Guyana. And that's the point that we're making. And you go in the villages and you see that. You see the attempt on the part of African Guyanese. But because in Guyana, we have never had a chance to correct the inequities through policies. There were attempts, as I like to say, in the early years of independence under the government of that day, to try to correct some of those inequities. And Brother UC himself played a role in those early years of the PNC government in trying to tackle the question of ethnic and social inequities in the society. But given the ethnic suspicions, governments are leery about tackling this question of ethnic inequities. And so we continue to reproduce them. And so as we talk about the villages today, that I think is the fundamental question in terms of village renewal and development, economic development in the villages, is the question of policies. Often, you know, we talk about these things, you know, African Guyanese can do this, they can do that, and so on. And I think what that discourse does is that it removes the responsibility of governance and institutions from dealing with the question of inequities. Going back to what Brother UC said earlier, that one of the first things the villagers did was to create their system of governance. And that is very important because they recognize that without a system of governance and without a system of equitable distribution of resources, there would be no progress. And so I think that's one of the lessons that we can learn from the early development of the villages. And as we begin to think about the problems in the village. One other thing I want to draw attention to is the question of the village as a peculiar space in Guyana, a cultural space. And I think part of the survival of the village is the fact that the village is this cultural space that people identify with. So the identity, people's identity are wrapped up with the villages. I often make the point that when I'm in Guyana, nobody asks me if I'm a Guyanese. They take it for granted. They ask me, where you from? I'm from Buxton, or I'm from Victoria, or I'm from Denhamstel. So the village, the identity is wrapped up in the villages. And I think that we have had in Guyana this discourse in which villagers have become afraid to invoke their identities, their village identity, which is of course is wrapped up with their African identity, because it's almost a crime in Guyana these days to point to your cultural identity. You are seen as racist, you are seen as disloyal to Guyana, you are seen as ancient, and so forth. So there has been a dumbing down of identity, and that has had a negative effect on organization within villages. And I can see that in my own village of Buxton, which we are celebrating today, is that the identity as Buxtonians is now being wrapped up with all kinds of negative things. And so people don't want to deal with the question of identity. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to contend with as we go forward. The villages are there, they're not going away. People live there, and we have to contend with the fact that they're there. We have a lot of young people in the villages, and because of a lack of a village, because of a lack of a village policy by successive governments, it means that a lot of the villagers are left behind, especially the young villagers. Those who find work have to leave the villages to go and find work. And if you can't find work, you're left in the villages, and there is very little opportunity for employment in the villages. You have small businesses, but they're not able to grow, so they cannot employ people in the villages. And so we have this unemployment, especially among the young people in the villages, which is a big challenge. And like I said, it takes policies, in my mind, to arrive at that. There is a limit to what people can do for themselves in terms of development on their own without institutions. I mean, we are living in 2020, we are living in the 21st century, in which the economy has become global in many regards. And so therefore one has to contend with that. But if the villages are going to move forward, we have to deal with the question of that labor. That labor, I don't want to call them limers and all kind of thing. They're labor and potential labor. that labor that is sitting there, and that it is not being exploited for development. And so it has an effect on the organization of the village, but it also has an effect on the people themselves and their own sense of worth and their own sense of who they are. So I think we have to struggle both at the level of the village themselves and what the people can do with what they have. But we also need to struggle at the level of policy. Brother Yussi talked about trade, and I think this is extremely important. A few years ago, Vincent and I were part of a discussion on the viability of the village as an economic unit. And I think it was Vincent who made the point that if a village cannot succeed on its own economically, it can enter into economic arrangements with other villages. So that if one village plants a lot of cassava, and you can have a factory in another village nearby, and so that you spread the notion of cooperatives from cooperation between and among individuals in a village, but between villages and among villages. And that is something that we can pay attention to. And this is the last point I'll make, because we're running short on time. The question of education in the village, I think, is very important. Back in the old days, as Brother Yussi mentioned, in the early days, education, he didn't get to expand on it, but education was the responsibility of the villages. And as we move into universal education, the question of the Buxton scholarship and all of those things, where education now becomes universal, those things began to recede. You know, in Buxton, where I grew up and I was growing up in the 1970s, there were 3 secondary schools in that village. And one, you know, Republic Cooperative High School, Brother Yussi School, we had Smith's College, and then we had the Buxton Secondary School. Imagine a small village with 3 secondary schools, 4 primary schools, and several kindergarten schools. I mean, I would joke with my friends and say, you really have to fight hard to be a dunce in those days in the villages. And I think part of the transition of schools away from the villages and the villages playing a role in education, I think, has had a terrible effect on the level of education among villages. And so we find the question of literacy becoming a very, very difficult problem in the villages. And we know that literacy or lack thereof has a lot of impact on other areas of life in villages and beyond. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, David. David has taken us into the contemporary situation in the villages. But I think there is no one better than a young person who lives in a village or who has had some success in his own life to tell us more about, on one hand, the contemporary situation, but more importantly, the vision of our young people for the villages. I would therefore like to invite Rexford Jackson, an attorney at law, who still lives in his village and who has become rather proactive in the local situation, to address us on the question of, as a young person, what's your understanding of this village and the village movement? And what's your vision for the village and the village movement?
Well, good night to all the viewers, and thank you to Ikeana for inviting me to be part of this illustrious panel. But I'd like to go back to what Brother Yussi touched on earlier, which is the fact that the emancipated slaves enacted codes by which they sought to govern themselves. And I think there were about 20 codes. So I can give you from a legal perspective how those codes helped to, in a systematic way, structure the village movement and the economy of those villages. But from a contemporary standpoint, I believe what has happened is that we have failed miserably to follow the model which was enacted by the the ex-slaves in 1845. And that is one of the reasons why we are in such a difficult situation. It may surprise you to know that, as Brother UC pointed out, these codes sort of laid the groundwork for what we now know as the Local Government Act, which was enacted, by the way, 100 years after, in 1945. So in my view, the codes that were enacted by the ex-slaves paved the way for the success, or the early successes of the villages, particularly in the village of Victoria. What I find has happened over the last maybe 5 or 6 decades is the fact that a lot of our young people are not familiar with the achievements of our foreparents. This is not something that is being taught in the local communities. So there is what Bob Marley would later sing about, a generation gap. We don't know what transpired before, and so we cannot build on the successes of our foreparents. And incidentally, it took the ex-slaves a minimum of 7 years after slavery to enact the codes. And one of the interesting things I found is that a mere 15 years after the abolition of slavery, the ex-slaves were able to commission a survey of the village, a very detailed survey, which was done by a surveyor by the name of Newlands. But when you look at what happened before, it shows clearly that there was a vision and there was a plan, and there is an obvious disconnect between the current generation and the work that was set out or established by the forebears.
All right, I take it, Rexford, that you have wound up your initial contribution there.
Yes, yes. I'll rest there for now.
Right, we don't have a lot of time. We have a question and answer session, and you probably have an opportunity during that session to see a bit more. But I want now to make my contribution, which seeks to look at the history on one hand, a history which says, look, these villages, to a very large extent, represented a liberation movement. And I think Brother EUC used that word, a liberation movement. And in that act of liberation, they sought to put in place institutional arrangements, because the development of any nation, so to speak, has to be founded on the establishment of institutions. And what we have seen over the years is these institutions have fallen apart. They've fallen apart for a number of reasons. They've fallen apart for the want of attention. They've fallen apart because of misuse by the state, maybe argue that the state in some instances stepped in where these bodies were established to make them status and then to misuse them to continue the acts of control and I dare say of oppression. And we've seen these villages, which are, I would call them natural communities, natural villages, have distorted in the sense that they have now become elements of larger local government bodies, larger statist government bodies. And so the power of the village has been diminished in the effort to grow the state and for the state to determine what happens rather than to have the people themselves from the bottom up determine what has happened. So as we talk today about Buxton, you don't any longer have that management committee in the form of village council. You now have Buxton as a part of a wider body called Fowls Buxton. As we talk about Victoria, you no longer have a Victoria as with a village council there. You now talk about Grove Haslington, and Victoria is a part of that. And everywhere where you go, where there were these village councils no longer are, and the authority for these villages now reside in a statist body, sometimes to the village's detriment. If we argue that the people in Victoria bought land and they distributed the land among themselves, but they also set aside land for communal use, whether it's for the church, for recreation, for schools, etc. For all intents and purposes, they should really be the ones who have ultimate control and direct control over those lands. But what has happened with the evolution of the status arrangement, where the local authorities came into being in the first instance, the village authorities, and now the bigger authorities that have absorbed these villages, you now have local authorities that are not of the village, for the village, exercising control over lands that were essentially lands of and for the village. And so they've usurped, is virtually taking away what may be seen as private property into state property and having bodies of people who are not from the particular village having control over those properties. Now, when one takes that situation and seeks to examine the wider national problem that we face with of majoritarian rule, one may well be able to look back to the village and say, in our villages, we had the solution. And in fact, if we were to return to the existence of some structures in our villages, we may be able to reinstitute the solutions that existed before. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we were to have village councils, and we were to allow those village councils to be responsible for whatever they can undertake at that geographic level and that economic level, then it would lend empowerment to the village and the people of the village. And they would not have to be relying on others to determine what happened in the village. And so the problems they're faced with in terms of not having the resources, not having the state support, could be diminished if we work a system out which says, look, we are going to allow these villages to have the authority to do what they can do at their level for themselves. But we're also going to ensure that from the pool of national resources to which they contribute by virtue of the individuals who are taxpayers, that they are allocated a fair amount from that pool to carry out these functions in the village for themselves, in addition to whatever resources they may also raise. And so what it does is to reduce the competition for resources and the apparent control that is discretionary, the allocation of funds that's discretionary, thus allowing the villages to look inward to a greater extent for village development, for village governance, and therefore reduce the competition we have presently for the allocation of resources, because we would then say, look, based on the size of the village, based on the level of development, this is what the central government will give to them to help in their own development, but they will then be the ones responsible for the development projects, for managing development. In that circumstance, they can turn to no one else to say, look, you are the source of our problem. You are starving us of resources. And so one could see in the potential of a governance system which returns us to that original system of governance where the villages were in charge of their own development, looking to see what may have been the shortcomings in those days, because in those days there were issues about the way in which the villages were taxed for everything and the insufficiency of resources, and the state not plowing resources in, although the villages themselves are great contributors to the state's resources. So looking at those deficiencies, seeing how those could be plugged, and allowing the villages to become the place where development takes place. And if you were to do that, you may turn to say, look, what you're doing, these are African villages you're talking about. But the fact of the matter, a village is a village. So if this happens, it would not be matter only for African villages or villages populated by African Guyanese, but other villages can follow the same pattern. So it's not a discriminatory system we're talking about. Suffice to say that the question of equity has to be a part of what is done. Because if you recognize that these villages were disadvantaged in the development from day one, then one may have to have an equitable mechanism to give them a chance to catch up with other areas that did not suffer from the same kind of beginning that these villages suffered from. And so in the context of governance, we may in fact return to the said villages, return to their own initiative in terms of governance, look at what were the disadvantages, the shortcomings, and reintroduce the system as a part of a solution to the national problem of development, which one would wish to be bottom up, and not to have the kind of competition we have nationally for resources, with the central government being the prize, and therefore having this conflict about who will be in central government. Because if you have the situation where the villages can rely on their own government and governance for the development, then central government becomes less important, and that too addresses the conflictual situation we have about central government and the whole electoral problems that we know so much about, which are very, very current. So that this is a proposition in terms of how do we allow these villages to become the centers of development? How do we allow them to reduce the level of conflict based on the concentration of power centrally? And how do we therefore create a governance system that will influence the developmental process, that will see all Guyanese being able to benefit, rather than have the very competitive situation where there's the argument that if one party is in government, then they tend to favor one set of people and another set of people suffer. Here is a solution which says that you will be in charge. It's not the largesse of a party that will determine your growth and development. It is your own control of your local situation. And incidentally, in our constitution as it is, as deficient as it is, it does provide an article which says that in fact, people could call for the establishment of village councils. And once they call for it, then the government should be responsive to the establishment of those councils. We also have another provision in the Fiscal Transfers Bill, which provides for allocation of resources from the center to local authorities based on population size, based on geographic size. And so that too could be reworked to make sure that there's equity in the distribution of resources for local development and reducing the importance of central government in the development process. Now, we have problems with time, so I will stop here. We have approximately 50 minutes more, and I will stop here and now open up for questions from those who have been listening for the last hour and 45 minutes. Now, I notice we have one question here. We have one question. The general concept of people and society changing is a daunting challenge for villagers and the populace as a whole. So change, you're saying, they're posing the question that change is a daunting challenge. And so what I would seek to ask the panelists to respond to is, how do you think that this daunting challenge of change can be overcome using the village as the institution, as the community for addressing that daunting challenge? David, you want to have a first go at that?
I would argue that the way you deal with the challenges of change is to go back to organization, which I think is the basis of community formation. And Brother UC walked us through that, where our ancestors engaged in meticulous and consistent organization. And I myself, in growing up in Buxton and growing up at a particular time, one of the things, among the many things that I think we learned from Brother UC's example, is the importance of organization. I can think of no challenge during the period that I was active in village affairs that there was not a challenge that we did not have an organization for. When it was the question of hunger, when it was the question in the 1980s of shortages of food items and children coming home in the middays and the parents not finished cooking, what to do about it. Organization, I have learned, was the key in terms of dealing with changes. And it's one of the things that I think is lacking in the villages, is the question of organization, because organization itself is a necessity, but it's a skill that you learn from being among people. And what organization does is that it brings people into the process of decision-making and how to overcome the challenges. And even as we talk about the question of literacy that I mentioned, about the question of labor not being used in the villages, I think part of what we have to do is to organize, because once you begin to organize, people recognize that after all, the problem is not insurmountable. And so I would argue for organization, that we recognize problems, but we organize and bring people into what Walter Rodney used to call, and one brother used to refer to it today, the question of self-activity for self-emancipation. And I think we have lost that in the villages, the kind of over-dependence on the state and the party, not for resources. I mean, we have to depend on on the state for resources because people pay taxes and so on and so forth. But I'm talking about initiatives, people in their communities taking their own initiatives and contending with the problems before them.
Thank you, David. I want to go to another question. And this one reads as follows. There are many examples of successful businesses by Afro-Guyanese. What is responsible for the apparent failure of people of African descent to sustain their position of leadership in business? I think this question was partly addressed during the discourse, but if any of the panelists want to have a go at that. Buddy, you see what I'm going to do? I'm going to ask you to hold, and in our last 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to kind of wrap us up, having heard what the other contributions were and based on your own response to the questions.
You're right, Vincent. And the premise of the question is that something is probably wrong with us as Africans, that business calls for a certain kind of genes and so forth. And I agree that business calls for a certain kind of attitude, and there may at the individual level be some attitudinal challenges. But I think as a group, I don't think that there is anything wrong with Africans and African Guyanese doing what it takes to run a business. I mean, I grew up in a village. I grew up in a household where my aunt sold black pudding for a living. And she was very adept, not just at cooking black pudding, but at the business of selling black pudding and so on. And that thing still exists among our people. So I don't think it's a question of attitude at the collective level. As Brother UC mentioned in the early years, it's a question of access to resources to grow, to expand, and to sustain, because business is about competition, et cetera, and the challenges African Guyanese face for all kinds of reasons, for social class reasons, because the vast majority of villagers are poor. And if you go to the bank, they ask you, where is your capital? Well, where is your capital? Where is it? For ethnic reasons, we know that given the ethnic dynamics in our country and who owns banks and so on and so forth, that there is a challenge there. And so I think that it's the problem are the institutional challenges that that African Guyanese as a group face. And I say that notwithstanding the fact that it is true that there are individuals who may carry a kind of bad habit, a kind of bad attitude that works against the expansion of businesses. But I don't think that there is some collective malaise among Africans that lead to the lack of success of their businesses.
I don't think one can ever argue that there's that malaise. There are so many examples of Africans starting up businesses and particular business sectors in this country that one could hardly argue that point. But is there an issue related to how African Guyanese have been affected over time through the struggle, post-emancipation struggle, that has led to issues of early gratification, which may affect success, not startup of business, not management, but sustainability, and the question of intergenerational wealth or post-intergenerational wealth. Now, I don't think we can really answer those questions right now, but I'm putting on the table that these are issues we probably have to look at. Early gratification and intergenerational wealth or approach to that as factors that may have impacted the sustainability and success of businesses which we were able to establish. But there's another question here.
I think too, Alexander. Yeah, I wanted to say that there is one of the first obstacles that we have to overcome is the myth that Africans are an indolent bunch of people. And what has been lacking in many of the communities is the fact that we don't have leadership. Leadership is lacking. And so people may want to do things, but they are not enough persons who can inspire and teach. And it goes back to what I said earlier. Sharing the knowledge of what the foreparents did before. Because as we know, they were successful businessmen and women. There is nothing that can actually prevent us from doing the same thing that they have done in the past. So we have to try and debunk that myth that Africans cannot do business or we're not successful. And it begins with re-educating our young people and those persons who are prospective entrepreneurs.
So in some regards, that's a psychological issue to some extent, and maybe a part of the package that I include in what I referred to earlier, early gratification and intergenerational wealth, both of which may be stemming from psychological issues rather than inability. We're really running out of time now. Let me go to a last question here. Sorry, we can't answer all of the questions, but I think this one is important. And the question says, how do you plan to re-educate villagers on the historical gap or void that has so effectively damaged the ideology and sense of being? Anyone wants to have a quick go at that?
Public education. And we are doing it now as we speak. And we have to do more of these things. There has been a kind of falling off of public education over the last couple of decades. We've now discovered these social media platforms where I can sit in Arizona where I work and be actively engaged in organizing and public education in Guyana. And I think we have to take advantage of these platforms in order to do that kind of public education work. Sometimes people say, well, you organize something and only 10 people show up. And a lot of people get turned off by that. And so therefore stop that work. But those of us who, of a certain generation, Vincent, know that you've got to begin somewhere, that you start with 10 people and it grows. So I think the answer to that is always public education, which is part of the organizing that I was speaking about just now. The two go hand in hand, that you organize for people to engage in their own liberation. But going hand in hand with that is the whole question of public education. Those of us who have had the opportunity to, be trained in the professions and so forth, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to those who have not had the same kind of opportunities to engage in the kind of organization and the kind of public education that is needed in the community. Walter Rodney used to say that when he was in Jamaica, he would go out into the communities and teach African history. But when he went out there, in effect, he was learning, because it is not that people do not have a sense and an instinct and some knowledge of their own history, but it is because they fear sometimes that if they express that, they are going to be branded racist and so forth. So I would think that once we engage in organization and constant public education, we will realize that the gap that we think is there is not as wide. as it appears, that people in their own spaces, in their own private spaces, and perhaps in their little organizations, are engaging in the kind of re-education that we are talking about. But it's not being brought together because there is not this intentional organization and attempt at public education.
Right. If we could just add to that this little bit, that the formal education system itself does not tell us anything about ourselves. And that in addition to public education at the informal and formal and non-formal level, that probably we need also to look to see what the formal system is doing in terms of telling us, Guyanese, and African Guyanese in particular, about ourselves. I think time has caught up with us, but I'd like to give the opportunity to our sage, venerable elder Ikeana, to give us some parting words.
Thank you, brother. I shall be very brief. I think one of the previous speakers have said and outlined with great care some of the things that our community suffers from. And I don't know where this is being recorded, how it is going to be used. We should not end up like church, going to hear sermons and then go back to the next sermon. Discussion, I think, should be followed by action. And I think one of the very important activities we have to learn, all of us, is listening. There's so much that is worrying people. And I believe especially young people. I'm close to some of them in my family here in Atlanta, and I'm observing them as much as I can. And young people have a drive, but we have to listen to them. And listening is an important activity. I say that not to say that it's the only thing, but in addition to what has been said, there's a whole catalog of operations of the state colonial system that victimize people of African descent because of their emergence out of enslavement. And it will be useful to study the development of the colonial system, especially if you want to compare African economy with the economy of others in the period after the Second World War or during and after the Second World War. It's very important to study where the infrastructure expenditure was concentrated and who benefited from it. There are also government measures that should have applied generally, and I will not detail them, but I'm offering, if the institution sponsoring this is important, because I've already begun to set down my experience of this kind of one-sided development sponsored by the colonial office and sponsored by domestic governments that did not benefit sufficiently people of our community. One thing we left out, the most important achievement of Africans after independence, was the garment factory at Buxton. It was set in motion by Buxton women. They not only can stop trains, but they can stop men and get them active and busy in assisting to establish industry. and they established construction cooperatives there, like Paramount and the Tropican Garment Factory, which had a cultural element to begin with. And I have to say was in its early stages supported by the existing PNC government after independence. The Buxton women wanted an independence project, and they got after people they think they could rely on in the village. And a lot of networking went on, and cooperatives were established. And I like to say that that garment factory moved to a point where it began to rate us something like number 4 in the country, from nothing. It had a Trinidadian manager who was a great expert and just walked into our company. So there are things that can be done. There's no reason for disenchantment, but we have to begin now. And I think all of us who can play some part should play a part. A lot has been said of great relevance and wisdom, and I don't want to add to my long-windedness at the opening of this session. And thank you very much. And I want to say that I'm available to this institution for anybody that is getting about constructive work, for whatever little I can contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brother EUC. And on that note, we have to unfortunately bring this session to an end. Time has caught up with us. It is clear that much more of this has to occur. It's also clear that Brother EUC said that we have to get beyond these conversations into action. And I think Ipadaji is itself charged to give leadership in that regard. But not only is Ipadaji charged, but all of those local Afrocentric organizations are charged to give leadership. Our youngest panel did identify leadership as one of the things that is lacking, and therefore is something that must be addressed. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the panelists, thank Brother EUC in particular for participating, and helping to make this continued emancipation series a success. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of the questions, but certainly we ought to, in the future, have other fora where we can indeed address in more detail some of the questions. So thank you all for participating. And please remember, this is not the end of it. I think we have another 1 or 2 activities to follow at the same time, the same place, to close off our emancipation activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night. Yeah, that's it.